My chair's dangerous, Grandma. Go ahead, try moving it, I said, my voice steady but my heart drumming in my chest. The afternoon air smelled of dried leaves and wood smoke, wrapping the porch in a crisp, familiar chill. Kyle's sneakers squeaked on the planks as he leaned forward, hands gripping the back of my cedar rocking chair, the same chair I'd sat in every morning for 30 years, reading the letters Henry sent me during his trucking days. He pushed hard. I stepped aside. The weight he expected me to bear was gone, and he stumbled, windmilling his arms before sliding down the porch steps with a loud thud. No broken bones, but his pride cracked clean through. His two friends froze at the edge of the yard, eyes darting from him to me, then back to the chair, like they'd just seen a ghost. That was the moment I knew I wasn't going to let anyone, blood or not, decide what stayed or went in my life. Follow my story to the end, and tell me which city you're listening from. I want to know how far a 74-year-old woman's stand can travel. The sky was the pale blue you only see in early October in Vermont, and the maple tree by the fence had just started to turn fire. Red. The air tasted of the lavender I'd planted along the porch rail, the same scent that clung to Henry's sweaters when he came in from the cold. My hands were warm around the ceramic mug, steam curling up to meet my face. I kept sipping as Kyle scrambled up, muttering something under his breath. I told you, it's Sikh? He cut himself off when I raised one eyebrow. The boy might have been 6 feet tall and full of swagger, but he still couldn't handle that look. Henry used to call it my schoolteacher stare, the one that could stop a lie mid-sentence. They'd shown up without calling, all three of them, under the pretense of helping me clear the porch. Translation: they wanted to start dismantling my home under my nose. I could see it in the way Kyle's gaze kept drifting past me to the flower beds, the old swing, the half-barrel planter that used to be a whiskey cask. To him, it was all clutter. To me, it was chapters of my life you don't just box up and toss. Inside, my thoughts were sharp as the wind off Lake Champlain. So this is how it starts, Helen soft words, busy hands, and before you know it, your name's off the deed. I'd heard the same story from half the widows at church, a nephew or a son helping them transition into something smaller, cheaper, easier to sell. Kyle's friend in the ball cap finally spoke. Maybe we should. You should get yourselves a coffee in town, I said, cutting him off, my tone sweet but firm. It's going to rain. It wasn't, but the way the clouds were stacking in the west gave me all the excuse I needed. They shuffled down the steps, Kyle shooting me a look that was half confusion, half irritation. I stayed on the porch, rocking gently, the boards creaking beneath me in their familiar rhythm. My knees ached less in that chair than anywhere else on earth, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me. When their car pulled away, I listened until the sound of the tires on gravel faded. Then I set my mug down, went inside, and reached for the file folder in the desk drawer. Bank papers, property tax receipts, and the contact card from Marianne, my lawyer of 30 years. My fingers lingered on the card. It had been a long time since I'd called her, but today felt like the right day. The scent of lavender followed me inside, mixing with the faint aroma of last night's apple pie. I thought of Henry again, of all the times he'd told me, "Don't wait until they've taken something, Helen. Act while it's still yours." I'd laughed then, certain our family was different, but the echo of Kyle's hands on my chair told me otherwise. I wasn't angry. Anger burned too hot too fast. What I felt was cooler, steadier. The kind of resolve you pour into concrete, knowing it'll set strong. There were steps to take, papers to sign, and choices to make that would leave no room for help I hadn't asked for. Out on the porch, the chair waited, its cedar arms smooth under my palms when I sat back down. The lavender swayed in the breeze, and for the first time in months, I let myself breathe all the way in. The porch smelled of lavender and cedar, just like it did the summer we moved in. Back then, Henry and I had spent our first week painting the railings white, laughing when the wind blew pollen onto the wet boards. His hands were always stained, wood stain, engine grease, flour from the bread he loved to knead on Sunday mornings. I could still see him in the yard, hammer in hand, building the swing that hangs from the old maple. "It's not just a tree, Helen," he'd said, squinting up at the branches. "It's the anchor for our home. We planted the lavender that same day, a hedge against the road and a gift to the bees. Now it was my hedge against forgetting. Inside the house, the kitchen clock ticked in its steady way, a sound I used to ignore but now clung to. It meant time was still mine. I remembered mornings when the table was crowded with neighbors dropping in for coffee, Henry pouring it strong and black. We never locked the front door then. The first hint of intrusion came years later, after Henry passed. My sister called, her voice syrup-sweet. "You shouldn't be alone out there. Maybe a condo in town?" She called it practical. I heard it for what it was, the first tug at the foundation we'd built. One winter, Kyle came by with his mother. Snow was piled against the porch steps, and they both looked around like they were surveying a property listing. "All this space must be hard to keep up," his mother said, brushing snow from her coat sleeve. I smiled politely, but inside I felt the boards of the porch tighten under my feet, as if they sensed the shift. After they left, I walked the room slowly, touching the doorframes, the bookshelf Henry had built, the kitchen counter with its tiny burn mark from the time he forgot the kettle. Every mark was a sentence in our shared story. To strip them away would be to erase the proof that we'd lived here fully. That evening, I sat in the rocker, blanket over my knees, the lavender hedge dark against the snow. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but I stayed, watching the way the light from the kitchen spilled onto the porch boards. It felt like a line drawn in warm gold, my threshold, my claim. From that night on, I listened more closely when family spoke about helping me. I noticed how often the word easier meant less yours. Each suggestion to downsize wasn't just about space, it was about control. Still, I kept my answers light, my tone even. It was better to wait, to hold the cards Henry and I had always kept close. And in the quiet moments, when the house was still, I told him in my mind, "I'm keeping it safe, love, just like we promised." The late afternoon light stretched long across the porch boards, warm and gold against the cedar grain. I shifted in the rocker, the creak matching the slow rhythm of the wind moving through the lavender. Across the street, Mrs. Penfield was wrestling a bag of groceries from her trunk. I waved, and she shuffled over, the smell of onions and fresh bread trailing behind her. "You had visitors earlier," she said, lowering her voice. "Didn't look like they came for tea." I smiled, small and practiced. "Family. They think I could use some help?" Her brows lifted just enough to make the meaning clear. Help wasn't always kindness. In this neighborhood, we'd all seen houses change hands before their owners were ready, deeds signed under the weight of persuasion. "They mean well," I added, though the words tasted thin. "Mrs. Penfield patted my arm, then turned back to her car. I watched her go, the slanting light catching the silver in her hair. Inside, I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the click of the burner snapping into place. Steam began to curl upward, carrying the faint scent of chamomile from the last brew. I glanced at the phone on the wall. One call to Marianne could start the process. Papers, signatures, the quiet protections Henry had once told me we might need. But I didn't dial. Not yet. Instead, I walked the length of the hallway, pausing at the doorway to the spare room. Boxes sat stacked against the wall, some labeled in Henry's neat block letters. Fishing gear, holiday lights, photo albums. Each one a piece of the life we'd lived, and none of it felt like clutter. A sound from outside drew me back to the porch. The wind had picked up, rustling through the maple leaves, sending a few spinning onto the steps. I bent to pick one up, the stem still green, the edges crisp with red. It was the kind of thing Henry would have pressed between pages, saving it for no reason except that it was beautiful. The street was quiet again. No cars, no footsteps, just the hum of the evening settling in. I sat back in the rocker, letting the boards groan softly beneath me. Somewhere beyond the calm, I could feel the slow tightening of a net. Conversations happening in kitchens that weren't mine. Decisions forming without my voice. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders, the lavender swaying at the edge of my sight. Whatever they were planning, they wouldn't find me unready. Not this time. It happened on a Saturday morning, the kind where the sun hits the porch just right and the smell of fresh bread from Mrs. Penfield's kitchen drifts across the street. I was trimming the lavender hedge, the clippings piling up in a neat, fragrant mound at my feet, when Kyle's voice broke the calm. "Still out here playing gardener, huh? You know no one's paying you for that?" He called from the gate, grinning like he'd said something clever. I straightened, secateurs in hand, the metal still warm from the sun. "It's my yard, Kyle. I keep it the way I like." He stepped onto the path, the gravel crunching under his sneakers. "Sure, but all this?" He swept a hand toward the porch, the flower beds, the swing. "It's outdated. You're one bad step away from the hospital." The words hung there, sharper than they had any right to be. Behind him, One of his friends from the other day leaned against the fence, pretending to check his phone, but clearly listening. I took a slow breath, the scent of lavender filling my lungs. "I've managed just fine." Kyle smirked, eyes scanning the yard as if appraising it. "Just saying, Helen, places like this, they're worth more when you strip out the sentimental junk." Someone ought to help you see that. There was a bite under the casual tone, a suggestion that I wasn't seeing clearly, that I needed steering. My fingers tightened on the secateurs. In my mind, I saw Henry at the workbench, sanding the cedar boards for the porch. He'd built it to last, not to be stripped, for resale. A car passed slowly on the street, the driver glancing over. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the sudden realization that Kyle didn't care who heard him. This wasn't a private push anymore. It was a public nudge toward surrender. "You've always been stubborn," he added, kicking at the gravel. "But stubborn gets lonely." The swing creaked in the breeze, the sound low and steady like a warning. I thought about the files in my desk drawer, the lawyer's number waiting. The net was tightening, but so was my resolve. From somewhere inside the house, the clock chimed the half-hour. Kyle glanced toward the door, as if expecting me to invite him in. I didn't move. The pause stretched, the air between us heavy with something unspoken. He shifted his weight, and I saw the momentary flicker of irritation cross his face. He wasn't getting the response he wanted. "Anyway," he said, stepping back toward the gate, "don't say no one offered to help when it's too late." I watched him go, the sound of the latch clicking shut louder than it should have been. The lavender hedge swayed gently, brushing my arm as if to remind me I was still standing on my own ground. But the taste of his words lingered, bitter at the back of my throat, and I knew this was only the beginning. The latch on the gate had barely settled back into place when the phone rang inside. I let it ring twice, brushing the last lavender sprigs from my sleeves, before stepping into the hallway to answer. It was my sister Clara. She didn't waste time on greetings. "Kyle stopped by," she said, her tone the kind that made a question sound like a verdict. "He's worried about you." "Is that what he told you?" I asked, leaning against the wall. The kitchen window let in a slant of late morning light, catching the dust motes in the air. "Well," he said, "you're resistant. You don't have to make everything so difficult, Helen. You're 74, not 24. Her words landed with the same weight as Kyle's smirk earlier, only sharper for being wrapped in familial concern. "Difficult?" I repeated, tasting the word. "For wanting to live in my own home." "Don't be dramatic. We just want to make sure things are handled before." She stopped, but the pause was enough. Before what? Before I couldn't defend myself. Before someone else made the choices for me. I glanced out the window toward the porch, where the rocker waited in the soft sun. "Clara, I've been handling things just fine." She sighed, a long exhale that crackled through the line. "Sometimes I think you hang on just to prove a point." That one stung, not because it was true, but because it wasn't. This wasn't about a point, it was about a promise. Henry and I had built that house to be lived in, until neither of us could climb the porch steps. He hadn't specified what to do if one of us was left alone, but I knew what he would have wanted. Clara's voice softened, which was always when I listened most carefully. "You can't expect us to keep coming around to check on you forever." "I've never asked you to," I said. The quiet in my voice seemed to catch her off guard. She mumbled something about needing to go and hung up without a goodbye. The house felt different after the call, the rooms still but not peaceful. I moved through them, touching the edges of furniture, the cool brass of the doorknobs, the grain of the banister Henry had sanded smooth. Every piece felt more mine than ever, yet I could almost hear the sound of hands measuring, evaluating, deciding. Back on the porch, the day had shifted. Clouds gathered low, muting the sun, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain from the lake. I sat in the rocker, letting it creak beneath me, and thought of the file folder in my desk. My gaze drifted to the hedge, its purple blooms swaying, and beyond it to the street where Kyle's car had been. I imagined him somewhere in town, talking to Clara. Maybe others, too, laying groundwork. The first drops of rain tapped against the porch boards. I pulled the blanket tighter and watched the street. The air was heavy, not just with weather, but with the sense that something else was on its way, something I'd need to be ready for. It was Tuesday when they arrived. Kyle, Clara, and a man in a dark suit who carried a leather folder under his arm. I'd just finished making tea, the scent of bergamot still hanging in the kitchen. They didn't ask to sit, they walked straight to the dining table as if it were their own. "This is Mr. Dalton," Clara said, pulling out a chair for herself. "He's a financial advisor. We thought it might be easier if you let him help you organize things." "I've been managing just fine," I replied, setting the teapot down between us. The china rattled slightly against the tray, though my hands were steady. Kyle leaned forward, grinning as if we were all in on a harmless secret. "We just don't want you buried in paperwork. You should be enjoying your time, not stressing over bills." Dalton opened his folder with the quiet precision of someone who'd done this many times. "We've prepared a few simple forms. They'll allow Kyle to handle any urgent matters if you're unavailable." The word hung there, dressed in politeness but sharp at the edges. Clara slid the first page toward me. It was printed on heavy paper, the kind meant to look official. My name was at the top, but the language underneath blurred into legal jargon. Too much for a quick glance. I took my time, letting the room settle into the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway. The paper smelled faintly of toner and something chemical, like it had been rushed from a printer that morning. Halfway down the page, a line caught my eye: transfer of authority over designated accounts. The list was long, longer than I expected, and one of the account numbers matched my savings. The one Henry and I had built for repairs, travel, emergencies. It wasn't just help they were offering. It was access. Kyle must have noticed where my eyes landed. "It's just a precaution," he said quickly. "You wouldn't even notice a difference day to day." I folded the paper once, sharply, and set it back on the table. "I think I'll need some time to read these." Clara exchanged a glance with Mr. Dalton, who gave a small, knowing nod. "Of course," he said, closing his folder. "But the sooner these are in place, the better protected you'll be." Protected? Another word dressed for company, hiding its teeth. The tea had gone cold. I poured myself a cup anyway, the steam barely rising. "I'll call you when I've looked them over," I said, my tone final. They didn't press, not outright. But as they left, Kyle's hand lingered on the back of my chair, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like a marker placed on a map. When the door closed, I stayed at the table, the folded paper resting under my palm. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a car door slammed, and I heard the low murmur of voices. I didn't move. The paper was still warm where my hand had been, and the line about designated accounts ran through my mind over and over, like a warning I couldn't yet say out loud. I waited until the sound of their car faded down the street before unfolding the paper again. The light from the kitchen window had shifted, casting the print in a pale gray. I read every line, lips moving silently over the legal phrases, the way Henry used to read out loud when he was making sense of an instruction manual. 2 pages in, I saw it again. The account number I knew by heart. I set the paper down and walked to the desk in the front room. The key to the bottom drawer hung on a thin ribbon inside the top. I unlocked it and pulled out my old leather ledger, the one I still kept even with online banking. The last entry was from a week ago. The balance I'd written in my tidy script didn't match the number on the paper in front of me. The air felt heavier. I put on my coat and slipped the folder into my bag. The lavender hedge swayed as I passed, brushing against my leg. A cold wind carried the scent down the street as I walked to the bus stop. I didn't want Kyle or Clara's car to be seen near the bank with me. The branch lobby was warm, almost too warm, with the faint smell of carpet cleaner. I waited in line, my fingers tight around the strap of my bag. When my turn came, I stepped up to the counter where a young woman with a name tag that read, "Jenna," greeted me with a practiced smile. "I'd like to review recent activity on my savings account," I said, sliding my ID across. My voice was steady, but I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. She typed quickly, her nails clicking against the keys. "Looks like there was a withdrawal last Thursday," she said, glancing at the screen. $5,000. The number landed like a stone in my stomach. "By whom?" Jenna hesitated. "It was processed in person. The signature on file matches an authorized user." "I am the only authorized user," I said. The words came out flat, without room for doubt. Her eyes flicked to mine, then back to the screen. "If you'd like, we can print the withdrawal slip." She handed me the paper, warm from the printer. The signature was familiar, but not mine. Close enough to pass at a glance, far enough to make my hand curl into a fist. "Would you like to place a hold or remove access for other parties?" Jenna asked. "Yes," I said. "Effective immediately." We went through the forms quietly. When it was done, I folded the printout and slipped it into my bag beside the folder Kyle had brought. As I stepped back onto the street, the wind had picked up cold and sharp. Clouds were moving in fast from the lake. On the bus ride home, I kept my hand over the papers as if they might blow away. Each bump in the road rattled through the seat into my spine, but my mind was already ahead. At the desk in my front room, at the locked drawer, at the phone number of the lawyer Henry had once trusted. By the time I reached my stop, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. I pulled my coat tighter and looked down the street toward my house. The porch light was off, though I could have sworn I'd left it on. The sight made my pace quicken. Something about the stillness waiting for me felt different, like the air right before a storm. The rain was steady by the time I reached the porch, a fine mist clinging to my coat. The light was still off, though I was sure I'd left it on that morning. Inside, the house felt cooler than usual, as if the warmth had been let out in my absence. I hung my coat by the door and stood for a moment listening. No creak from the settling boards, no hum of the old fridge that sometimes rattled when it was tired. Just quiet, the kind of quiet that feels watched. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. I'd look out at the street and see fewer familiar faces. Mrs. Penfield, who used to wave from her porch every morning, now gave only a quick nod before heading inside. The mail arrived later, and some days it was just a single flyer, no letters, no bank statements. On Wednesday, I walked down to the corner store. The clerk, a young man who'd always been quick with small talk, barely met my eyes. "Your nephew was in here," he said as he rang up my tea. "Said you might not be out much anymore." He said it casually, but the words lodged under my skin. That evening, I called the library to check on a book I'd reserved. The librarian told me there was no record of my name on the hold list. I knew I'd written it down the last time I was there, in the same neat cursive I'd used all my life. The pattern formed slowly, like water seeping under a door. Calls from old friends stopped. Messages I left for Clara went unanswered. Even the man who plowed my driveway each winter hadn't shown up after the last light snow. And then there was Emily. She knocked one Thursday afternoon, her hair damp from the drizzle, holding a small box of blueberry muffins. "Thought you might like these," she said, stepping inside without waiting for me to insist. Her presence warmed the room in a way the old radiator couldn't. We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from our tea. She told me about her classes, about the book club she'd started with 2 friends. I listened, grateful for the sound of another voice in the house. But even with her there, I felt the edges of the silence pressing in. "Have you noticed folks acting different?" I asked. Emily hesitated. "Maybe, but people talk, Aunt Helen. They listen to whoever speaks the loudest." Her eyes met mine, steady and kind, but I could see the caution there too. She didn't want to say more, maybe to protect me, maybe to protect herself. Still, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. After she left, I walked through the house, checking each room as if something might be missing. Everything was in place, yet it all felt slightly shifted. The lavender outside swayed under the weight of the rain, the scent drifting faintly through the cracked window. That night, lying in bed, I heard the faint sound of a car slowing outside. The engine idled for a few seconds, then pulled away. I didn't get up to look, but I knew the quiet was no accident anymore. Saturday morning brought a thin layer of frost over the porch steps. I brushed it away with the side of my boot and headed toward the market. The sky was a pale blue, the kind that makes you believe it will be warmer than it is. My breath hung in the air as I walked. At the bakery, the usual Saturday crowd gathered near the coffee counter. I spotted Ruth and Marlene, women I'd known since Henry first brought me to town, talking in low tones by the window. When I stepped inside, the bell over the door gave its cheerful chime, but their conversation stopped mid-sentence. Ruth offered a tight smile, Marlene glanced at the floor, and then they both turned toward the pastries as if deciding between scones and muffins required their full attention. I ordered a loaf of rye and a small bag of rolls, the clerk wrapping them in brown paper without meeting my eyes. The warmth of the bread seeped through the bag as I walked out, but it didn't touch the cold that had settled in my chest. Halfway home, I took the long route past the community center. The front doors were propped open, and I could hear the echo of voices in the hall. A familiar one, Clara's, rose above the rest. "It's not safe for her anymore," she was saying. "She's stubborn, but we can't wait until there's an accident." A man's voice answered, low and even. You have options. Places where she'd be looked after. I stopped just short of the doorway, the wind tugging at my scarf. Clara's heels clicked on the wooden floor as she paced. If she won't agree, we may have to make the decision for her. The words were muffled by the next burst of conversation inside, but I didn't need the rest. The meaning was plain. I moved on before anyone stepped into the doorway, keeping my pace steady, my back straight. The street seemed quieter than before, the houses watching from behind their curtains. My shadow stretched long on the pavement, each step matching the thud of my heartbeat. At the corner, Mrs. Penfield was sweeping her porch. She looked up, hesitated, then waved. A small, uncertain motion, before turning back to her broom. By the time I reached home, the rye bread had cooled. I set it on the counter untouched and stood at the kitchen window, watching the lavender hedge sway in the brittle air. Pieces were falling into place, too many to ignore. The sudden silences, the averted eyes, the missing mail. The conversation at the community center, it wasn't just distance, it was a plan. Upstairs, in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, lay the envelope Henry had once called, or insurance against foolishness. Inside were documents, copies of the deed, and a letter with his careful handwriting. I ran my hand over the lid but didn't open it. Not yet. A car slowed outside, tires crunching on the frost. Through the curtain, I saw the shape of Kyle's SUV idling by the curb. It stayed there for a long moment, then eased away. I stepped back from the window, the frost in the air matching the chill under my skin. Whatever they were building around me, it was nearly complete, and I needed to be ready before the last piece fell into place. Clara called it a little get-together. Just family, she said. A chance to reconnect. I almost declined. But something in her voice, too sweet, too practiced, made me accept. If they were going to put on a show, I wanted a seat in the front row. Her living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and furniture polish. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth not quite reaching the circle of folding chairs they'd arranged in the center. Kyle stood near the mantel, holding a mug, his smile just wide enough to seem sincere. There she is, Clara announced when I walked in, her tone the same she used with toddlers and guests she didn't like. Everyone, let's make sure Aunt Helen gets the comfortable chair. It was an old recliner pushed into the middle of the room, its fabric worn and sagging. I sat, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the eyes on me. Conversations that had been easy and scattered moments ago now drifted into a single thread. Kyle started. We've been talking about how to make things easier for you, Aunt Helen. He glanced around, inviting nods. Your house is a lot for one person. Marlene from the bakery piped up from the corner. It's just not safe for you to be alone, dear. Stairs, icy steps, it's a matter of time. Each word was dressed in concern, but the undertone was sharp. I could feel the weight of them pressing me down in the chair. The fire popped, a spark leaping, and I thought of how Henry used to tend a flame, always careful, always patient. Clara leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. We all love you, Helen, and we just want the best. But sometimes the best means accepting help, even when it's hard. I let the words wash over me, studying their faces one by one. There was a satisfaction in some eyes, hesitation in others. The room smelled faintly of overbrewed coffee now, bitter beneath the cinnamon. When I spoke, my voice was calm. Help can mean a lot of things. Kyle nodded quickly. Exactly. And in this case, it might mean selling the house and moving somewhere you don't have to worry about maintenance. We've even looked into a few places. Beautiful gardens. Activities? Supervised dining, Marlene added. The heat in my chest didn't rise the way they might have hoped. Instead, I thought of the folder in my desk, the withdrawal slip in my bag, the envelope in the cedar chest upstairs. Every piece was part of a puzzle they didn't know I was assembling. I sipped the lukewarm tea Clara had set before me, meeting Kyle's eyes over the rim. You've all certainly put a lot of thought into my life. He opened his mouth, but I didn't give him the space to fill. Makes me wonder what you've been doing with your own. A small silence fell, just enough to draw a few surprised looks. Then the chatter resumed, lighter now, as if they'd smoothed the wrinkle. But I'd seen the flicker in Kyle's gaze, the quick calculation. I stayed through the rest of their speeches, nodding when expected, offering no resistance they could grab hold of. When it was time to leave, I thanked Clara for the lovely evening and took the cinnamon scent with me out into the crisp night. On the walk home, the stars were sharp against the dark, the air cold enough to sting my lungs. My mind was already turning, not on what they'd said, but on what they'd shown me, how they liked to gather, to plan, to talk in circles until they thought I'd give way. Next time, I thought out the next evening, the town hall glowed with string lights draped across its high windows. Inside, the annual winter charity dinner was already in motion. Long tables covered with white cloths, the smell of roast chicken and apple pie drifting above the low hum of voices. I'd barely stepped inside when I caught sight of Clara at the far end, laughing with a group near the raffle table. Kyle was beside her, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing as he spoke. Heads turned in my direction, then turned away just as quickly. That same ripple of silence I'd felt in her living room seemed to follow me in. I took a seat at a table near the wall, where I could see without being in the center of anything. The chair wobbled slightly, the leg uneven, but I kept my balance. A paper place card with my name sat in front of me, though the handwriting wasn't mine. Halfway through the meal, a man I didn't recognize tapped a spoon against his glass. "Before dessert," he said, smiling broadly. "Clara's asked me to share something lighthearted." He launched into a story about elderly relative who'd once mistaken a neighbor's cat for a raccoon and called animal control. The punchline drew scattered laughs. I didn't need the details to know who he meant. Clara had dressed the tale in just enough vagueness to keep it from being named, but the eyes that darted my way gave it form. I let the laughter settle, took a sip of water, and rose slowly from my chair. "Funny thing about stories," I said, my voice even. "The ones worth telling are the ones where no one's dignity is the punchline." A few faces froze. Clara's smile stayed in place, but it looked tighter now, the corners pulling just a little too much. I sat back down, smoothing my napkin over my lap. The conversation shifted quickly, someone announcing the next raffle prize, but the air in that corner of the room had cooled. When dessert came, a slice of apple pie with a dollop of cream. I took my time with it, watching the way people leaned in to speak to each other, the way Clara kept glancing my way as if to measure whether I'd stirred more than just her joke. After coffee, I moved toward the coat rack. On the table beside it sat a stack of envelopes, donation receipts addressed to each guest. Mine was on top. I slid it into my purse, but not before noticing another envelope just beneath it, my name scrawled on the front in hurried ink. Inside was a photocopy of a bank statement. My bank statement. I slipped it in with the donation receipt, my hand steady even as my pulse picked up. No one had noticed. The chatter behind me rose and fell, the clink of plates being cleared blending into the sound of someone at the microphone thanking sponsors. Outside, the night air was crisp, the snow underfoot squeaking with each step. The envelope pressed against my side felt heavier than paper should. Someone had wanted me to see it? Someone not sitting at that table with Clara and Kyle. I paused at the corner before heading home, looking back at the warm glow of the town hall. Inside, they were still laughing, still talking, still sure they were steering the evening, but in my bag was proof that another current was moving beneath theirs. And for the first time in weeks, the cold air didn't sting, it cleared. The wind had picked up by the time I reached my porch, carrying the faint scent of snow from the mountains. Inside, the house was as I'd left it, quiet, the air cool, the lavender hedge outside tapping against the siding like a soft, persistent knock. I hung my coat and set my purse on the kitchen table. The envelope from the town hall was still warm from being pressed against my side. I slid it open with the butter knife I kept by the bread box and slid out the single sheet inside. It was a bank statement, dated last month. My name, my address, the familiar account number, and a line of transactions that didn't match the ledger in my desk. A withdrawal for $5,000 I already knew about, but below it another for $3,000, made just 3 days later. Both in person. Both signed. The signature was again close enough to fool a glance, but now I saw the telltale break in the loop of the H, the slight hesitation in the tail of the N. It wasn't mine. My fingers tightened on the paper until the edge bit into my skin. I spread the statement beside the folder Kyle had brought me weeks earlier. The account numbers matched. The dates lined up with his visit and the family meeting Clara had called. My mind replayed the way he'd stood on the porch that day, casual, too casual, asking about my schedule. The lamp above the table hummed faintly, casting a yellow circle over the papers. I traced the columns with my finger, marking each withdrawal in pencil. Whoever had left this for me knew I'd see the pattern. They'd risked being caught to make sure I did. I thought of the stack of envelopes at the coat rack, the noise of the room, the way my name had been written in a hand I didn't recognize. Not Clara's neat script, not Kyle's blocky print. Someone else. Someone who'd been close enough to the donation table to slide it under the receipt without being noticed. The question sat heavy. Were they helping me, or using me for their own game? The only way to find out was to follow the paper. I gathered the statement and the folder into my bag, tucking them beneath the cedar chest key. In the front hall mirror, my reflection looked back steady-eyed, the faint lines around my mouth set in something between resolve and defiance. Upstairs, I opened the cedar chest and removed Henry's envelope. I didn't open it, just held it for a moment, feeling the weight of his careful planning. He'd always said, "Trust the paper trail, Helen." People can lie, but ink can't. The clock in the hall struck 11, the chime echoing through the stillness. I went to the desk, pulled out a small notebook and wrote a single line. A bank 9 a.m.s. I slipped the notebook into my coat pocket. Tomorrow I'd walk in, not to ask but to see. Records, signatures, any trace of who had been moving my money without my consent. And maybe, just maybe, I'd start to find out who had decided I needed this warning. Outside, the wind rattled the porch rail, and a few flakes of snow swirled past the window. I left the light on in the kitchen that night, the yellow glow spilling across the table, keeping watch over the papers laid neatly side by side. Nam Vicky Tupungi 2, Chekungi 7 Target 6050 Tia Tam Titin Kai Dungsen Vitzel In Yi Am Saw, Helen Luniagazi Gexemte Lukio Siaktema Asetas Geo D they Chi Vu Chitu Kide? Nan Vidin Ban Siu El they Chis Nakingel Unji Trevlan, Chugwan Ki Helen G I Chudden Biat NG Mekche Teach, Kale Hala Koshir! Bifat Hinnigan, Amangyo Che Klegang and Chi Shaloto Kyle. Mu Chen Sikis them Gia Clathi Mek Nan Vit Kok Trong Janan Ho Sisi Junkan Igan Emin Kita Tit Leko He Ti. Gitu Nat P Seed and the Inginungling Ingi Kalanga Helen Bakais Lakos Hegegzc. Kedi But NG Cliff Meet Jaiti Ho Chingani Kai Ikai Thalas Enyqua Kain Bi Bite Menad Fitai Itam and Janan A Femp. The morning came cold and sharp, the sky the color of pewter. I left early, the bank opening its glass doors just as I stepped onto the sidewalk. Inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from behind the counter, mingling with the faint tang of disinfectant. A young teller greeted me with a polite smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Carver. How can we help you today?" "I'd like to review a couple of recent transactions," I said, keeping my tone casual. "There seems to be a discrepancy in my records." She led me to a small desk tucked in the corner, away from the line of waiting customers. "Let me pull those up for you," she said, fingers moving over the keyboard. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then to me. "Yes, I see 2 withdrawals last month. Would you like the signed slips?" "That would be helpful," I said, setting my bag on my lap. She disappeared into the back office, returning with a slim folder. Inside were the 2 slips, each with my name and signature in neat blue ink. At first glance, they were close enough to fool anyone not looking. But I knew my own hand. The loops too tight, the letters leaning forward just a little too far. "These were done in person?" I asked. She hesitated. "Yes, that's what the system says." Her voice softened, and she glanced toward the glass wall of the manager's office. I tapped the corner of one slip. "The date here?" I said lightly. "That was the same day my nephew visited. I remember because he brought me a box of pears. From Oregon." I smiled, as though it were nothing more than a pleasant memory. Her eyes darted away again. "I can't say who was at the counter that day." "Of course," I said, folding the slips neatly. "But you can see why I'd want to be certain." The manager appeared then, a tall man with a careful expression. "Is everything all right here?" "We're just reviewing a couple of transactions," I told him. "It's curious. My signature is here, but I don't recall making the trip." He gave a tight smile. "Sometimes family members handle errands on behalf of our clients, all with permission." Naturally, I echoed. "And if they didn't have permission?" The smile didn't falter, but his fingers tapped the edge of the folder. "Then it would be a violation. But we'd have to confirm that." I nodded, letting the silence stretch until he cleared his throat. "We'll look into it, Mrs. Carver." As he turned away, the young teller slid a small post-it note toward me under the folder. Just a name, written in quick pencil, A.L. Barrett. She didn't meet my eyes, but the slight tremor in her hand told me enough. I tucked the note under my palm, thanked them both, and left with the slips in my bag. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of exhaust from a passing truck. On the corner, I stopped to read the note again. The name wasn't Kyle's. It wasn't Clara's, but I knew it. I'd seen it on the town council bulletin board, attached to someone who'd always been too friendly at public events, too quick to offer help. With community matters, a bus roared past, and I slipped the note into my coat pocket. The cold felt sharper now, not from the wind, but from the understanding that this wasn't just family. This was bigger. Back at the house, I locked the door behind me and spread the slips and the note across the kitchen table. The edges curled slightly in the dry air, the ink catching the light. Somewhere out there, someone knew I'd been warned. And if they were watching me before, they'd be watching closer now. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The house was silent except for the faint tick of the hall clock and the occasional groan of the rafters settling in the cold. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting as the streetlight outside swayed in the wind. Henry's voice came to me in pieces, the way it often did when I was on the edge of sleep. "Never let anyone else hold your pen," he'd said once after a neighbor lost her home to a nephew's clever paperwork. "And if they try, make sure they remember you can write your own name." I turned onto my side, the blanket heavy around my shoulders. The name on the post-it, L. Barrett, floated in my mind alongside Kyle's practiced smile and Clara's syrupy voice at the charity dinner. The pieces fit together too well to be coincidence: the family pressure, the sudden interest in my house, the withdrawals timed perfectly with their visits. The envelope at the town hall hadn't been an accident. Someone wanted me to see the truth. The question was whether they wanted to help me or just watch what I'd do with it. I sat up, swung my feet to the floor, and felt the chill of the wood boards under my toes. In the kitchen, the light from the street lamp spilled across the table where the bank slips and the post-it still lay. The paper edges caught the light, each one a small shard of something larger. I walked through each room, touching the backs of chairs, the door frames, the bookshelf Henry built by hand. The air smelled faintly of cedar and the dried lavender from the porch. This wasn't just a house. It was a record. Every nail and board, every photograph on the wall, a chapter I'd lived. They wanted me to sign it away as if it were nothing more than a set of keys. I paused by the front window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the street. Empty, snowflakes drifted lazily under the lamplight. Still, I had the strange sense of being observed, as if somewhere out there, behind a darkened window, someone was taking note of my every move. Back at the table, I pulled my notebook from the drawer and opened to a fresh page. I wrote the date in the top corner, then underlined it. Below, in steady block letters, I listed the first steps. 1. Verify all account activity, in person only. 2. Identify connection between Kyle Clara and L. Barrett. 3. Secure deed and related documents in a safe location. 4. Discreetly gather allies, people who owe me nothing and trust me more than them. I stopped, tapping the pen against the page. The trick wasn't to move quickly. The trick was to move so quietly that, by the time they realized, it would already be done. A gust of wind rattled the porch rail, the lavender tapping against the siding again like a quiet signal. I closed the notebook and slid it into the pocket of my robe. There was no comfort in the night's silence, but there was clarity. I finally knew where to begin. The clock struck 2, each chime carrying through the house like a quiet reminder that the night was slipping away. I sat in the armchair by the window, my robe wrapped tight, watching the shadows crawl across the floor. Henry had handled his share of betrayals, though he never called them that out loud. I remembered one summer when a contractor tried to overcharge us for the deck. Henry didn't raise his voice or threaten lawyers. He simply pulled out every invoice, every note, every signed estimate, and laid them out in perfect order. By the time the man saw his own handwriting proving the real price, he backed down without another word. Never fight with your fists when you can fight with facts. Henry had told me that day, sliding the papers back into their folder. People can argue with you. They can't argue with their own signature. The memory steadied me. I rose from the chair and went to the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were neatly stacked folders, bank statements, tax records, insurance policies, the original deed. I spread them out on the bed, the lamp casting warm light over the crisp edges. From the back of the chest, I retrieved a small fireproof box Henry had bought years ago. Its key hung from a nail behind the pantry door. I unlocked it and began transferring the most critical papers inside: the deed, the last 10 years of tax returns, the notarized will. The weight of each document in my hands was more than paper. It was proof and protection. In the desk drawer, I found an old accordion file stuffed with receipts and letters. Most were harmless, but a few stood out. A handwritten note from Clara offering to help with my banking when I had the flu 2 years ago, a flyer for a community fundraiser with L. Barrett listed as treasurer, an old check endorsed by Kyle in my name for deposit. I placed them in a separate envelope and wrote a single word across the front: leverage. By the time I finished, the bed was clear except for the cedar chest. I locked the fireproof box and slid it under the bed, pushing it far enough that no one could spot it without getting on their hands and knees. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of water, the faucet hissing softly in the stillness. I stood by the counter, sipping slowly, my eyes drifting toward the front window. Outside, the street lay empty under a dusting of snow. A single lamplight painted a circle of pale gold on the pavement. I thought about how easy it would be for them to believe I was doing nothing. Just an old woman wasting her nights on memories and tea. That belief was my shield. The quieter I moved, the more certain they'd be of their advantage. Setting the glass in the sink, I walked back to the window. My reflection looked back at me, faint and silvered against the dark glass. The lines on my face seemed sharper in the dim light, but my eyes were clear, focused. Tomorrow would come quickly. And when it did, I'd be ready to start placing my pieces on the board, one quiet move at a time. The morning broke pale and still, the kind of winter light that flattened everything into shades of gray. I dressed in layers, choosing a wool coat and plain scarf that wouldn't stand out. The key to moving unseen wasn't invisibility, it was looking exactly like you belonged. At the bank, I kept my voice calm but firm. "I'd like to update my account information," I told the clerk, sliding my ID across the counter. The glass partition reflected both our faces, mine steady, hers politely neutral. She tapped at her keyboard, asking if I wanted to keep the existing authorized users. "There are no authorized users," I said, meeting her eyes. "Not anymore." A flicker passed across her expression, gone before I could name it. She printed a set of forms and handed me a pen. My signature flowed easily this time, the ink sinking into the paper in familiar curves. When she asked for a new security password, I gave her one Henry and I had once used for our travel plans, a word no one else in the family would guess. From the bank, I walked 2 blocks to the post office. The air smelled faintly of exhaust from the delivery trucks idling out back. Inside, the clerk recognized me from years of mailing Christmas packages. "Morning, Mrs. Carver," he said. "Need stamps? Forwarding change?" I replied. "I'd like all mail related to my finances held for pickup." I filled out the form while he chatted about the snow forecast, nodding without adding much. The less detail I gave, the better. Next was the county records office. The building's marble lobby echoed with every footstep, the walls lined with framed maps and land deeds from decades past. I requested a certified copy of my property deed and the most recent tax assessment. The clerk, a young man with a tired voice, slid the papers across the counter. "You know," he said quietly, "most people don't bother with this unless they're getting ready to sell. Just keeping my files in order." I answered, folding the documents into my bag. By midday, I'd crossed the main errands off my list. I stopped at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a hardware shop. Over a cup of tea, I pulled out the envelope labeled leverage and reviewed its contents. The note from Clara, the fundraiser flyer, Kyle's endorsed check, each one a piece of the puzzle. But as I reshuffled them, something caught my eye. The corner of the fundraiser flyer had handwriting I hadn't noticed before, faint pencil marks near the bottom. I angled it toward the light. A paid-in-full Barrett. The name was like a pin dropped on a map, marking a route I hadn't taken yet. If L. Barrett had been handling money for the event, and their name was tied to these withdrawals, the connection was no longer guesswork. It was a thread I could follow. I folded the flyer carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. Outside the cafe window, the snow had started, light flakes swirling in the air. I finished my tea, left a tip, and stepped out into the cold, my bag heavier now not from weight, but from the shape of the plan forming inside it. The street was quiet, the snow muffling the sound of my steps. I headed home, each block bringing me closer to the next move. By the time I reached my porch, the flyer's pencil marks felt less like an accident and more like a message meant for me alone. The snow had thickened by afternoon, laying a thin, clean sheet over the sidewalks. I waited until the street was nearly empty before locking up the house and walking toward the edge of town. My destination wasn't on Main Street or anywhere public. It was a 2-story brick building above the old hardware store, where the front window always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. James Porter had known Henry for 40 years. They'd hunted together, played chess in the park, and traded favors that never made it into the minutes of any meeting. Now retired from the town council, James still kept a small office where he sorted papers. As he liked to say, I knocked twice, then once more our old signal. The door opened to a warm room cluttered with filing cabinets and the hum of a space heater. James looked older, but his handshake was firm. Helen. Haven't seen you in months. Come in, before you freeze. I settled into the worn leather chair by his desk, the air thick with the smell of paper and old wood. I need a name confirmed, I said, keeping my voice low. And I need it to stay between us. His eyes narrowed just slightly. You've still got that look Henry used to get when something didn't sit right. He reached for a notepad. Ooh, Barrett. Connected to a fundraiser last fall. Treasurer, maybe? James tapped his pen against the desk, then swiveled to a cabinet in the corner. The drawers squeaked as he rifled through manila folders. Here, he said after a moment, sliding out a sheet. Linda Barrett. Treasurer for 3 community events in the past year. And, he flipped the page, former administrative assistant at your bank. Left under vague circumstances. The words settled between us. What kind of circumstances? I asked. Rumors of procedural shortcuts. Nothing proven, but she knew her way around signatures and access logs. He set the file in front of me, his finger resting on a list of committee members. 2 more names jumped out, one I recognized from Clara's bridge club, the other from Kyle's softball team. My pulse ticked faster. That's not coincidence. No, James said, leaning back. If Barrett's involved, she's not acting alone. And if they've been moving money, they'll want to close whatever gap you've left open. I kept my hands flat on the desk, resisting the urge to grip the file. I need copies of this? Quietly? He nodded, slid the pages into his copier, and handed me the duplicates. Be careful, Helen. This is the kind of thing that makes people nervous. I slipped the papers into my bag, the weight of them pressing against my side. I've been nervous for weeks, I said. Now I'm just paying attention. The snow outside had deepened to ankle height, muffling the world into silence. I walked home along the back streets, avoiding the main intersections. Each block brought the names and connections into sharper focus. Barrett, the bank, the fundraiser, Clara's bridge club, Kyle's circle. It wasn't just about my account anymore. It was about a network that thrived on shared secrets and blurred boundaries. By the time my house came into view, a single light burned in the living room, casting a warm rectangle onto the snow. I paused at the gate, listening to the quiet, then glanced back down the street. No movement, just the falling snow. Inside, I spread the copies on the kitchen table, aligning them with the bank slips and the fundraiser flyer. The pattern was there now, impossible to miss. And if I could see it, so could they, unless I stayed ahead. I closed the folder, locked it in the fireproof box, and drew a single line in my notebook under tomorrow's date of move faster. They will. The morning air was sharp enough to sting my lungs. I stepped onto the porch with my bag already packed. Documents, ID, the small fireproof box tucked in the bottom beneath a wool scarf. Today wasn't for hesitation. Today was for closing every door they thought was still open. At the bank, I arrived 5 minutes after opening. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish, the tiles still damp from the janitor's mop. A different clerk greeted me this time, a young man with careful manners. How can I help you, Mrs. Carver? I need to move all my accounts into a private holding today, I said, sliding my ID toward him. He blinked, glanced at the stack of papers I laid on the counter, then nodded. Of course, we'll require your signature on a few forms. The pen felt solid in my hand. Each stroke of my name was a small act of reclamation. By the time the transfers were done, my checking, savings, and certificates of deposit were all in my name only, linked to a new account number no one else knew existed. From the bank, I crossed the street to the attorney's office. The receptionist recognized me immediately. Mrs. Carver, Mr. Sloan can see you in 10 minutes. I sat in the waiting area, the hum of the copy machine in the background. When Sloan called me in, I wasted no time. I need my property deed and will updated. Effective today. No shared authority, no co-signers. And I want this deed placed into the Carver Preservation Trust we discussed last year. He adjusted his glasses. That will put the house and land entirely outside any private claim. Family or otherwise. That's the idea, I said. He set to work, the rhythmic clack of his keyboard filling the room. While he typed, I opened the fireproof box on his desk, showing him the originals of every document. Each one was scanned, notarized, and returned to me in a fresh folder. The trust paperwork would be filed with the county by the afternoon. Next stop was the post office, where I rented a new P.O. box under my full legal name, no forwarding. The key was cool in my palm as I slid it into my coat pocket. Any correspondence tied to my finances would go there now, out of reach. By noon, I'd looped back home to swap the fireproof box for a smaller folder, leaving no sign I'd been gone longer than a morning errand. The snow from yesterday had crusted over, crunching under my boots as I walked the last block to Sloane's office again. The trust documents were ready. I signed them with the same steady hand, my breath fogging the glass of the conference table as I leaned forward. Sloane handed me the filed copies, his tone measured. After today, they won't be able to touch a thing. I stepped outside into the brittle sunlight, the folder warm under my arm. Across the street, the windows of the diner reflected the pale sky. Somewhere out there, Clara and Kyle still believed they had time. They didn't. The wind cut sharper by the time I reached home, but the sun had climbed just high enough to turn the snow into a glittering crust. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and let the familiar scent of cedar and lavender close in around me. The house was still, like it was holding its breath with me. I set the folder from Sloane on the kitchen table, then went straight to the bedroom. The fireproof box came out from under the bed and onto the quilt. One by one, I removed the documents, deed transfer, updated will, new account numbers, and arranged them in a precise stack. It was a quiet inventory of everything I'd just sealed off from reach. From the top drawer of my dresser, I pulled a smaller envelope. Inside were the pieces I'd labeled leverage days ago: Clara's note, the fundraiser flyer, the check with Kyle's endorsement. I laid them alongside the trust papers, two halves of the same defense. One built on law, the other on pressure points they didn't know I had mapped. I boiled water for tea, letting the kettle's whistle cut through the silence. The steam rose in curls as I poured, and I stood there, cup in hand, thinking about how quickly people mistake stillness for weakness. They'd been walking toward this moment for months. I just stepped off the path they thought I was on. The phone rang, breaking the calm. The sound was too sharp, too insistent to ignore. I crossed the room and picked up. "Helen Carver?" Clara's voice came through bright and falsely warm. "Helen! I was just talking with Kyle, and we thought it'd be nice to come by this afternoon." "Around 4? We have some things to go over about the house." The pause she left after "house" was deliberate, a little bait on the line. I could almost hear the smile behind it. I kept my tone even. 4 o'clock, you said?" "Less," she replied quickly. "We'll bring coffee." "It's always better to chat in person." "Of course," I said, glancing at the folder on the table. "I'll be here." We exchanged the kind of polite goodbyes people use when neither believes the other. I hung up, the click sounding louder than usual in the quiet kitchen. 4 hours. They were moving faster than I'd expected. Good. That meant they were nervous, or desperate. Either way, they'd come into my space thinking they still had a claim. I rinsed my cup, dried it, and slid the leverage envelope into my robe pocket. Then I gathered the trust documents and locked them back in the fireproof box. The key went into my coat lining, sewn into the seam months ago when I'd first suspected trouble. Outside, the snow shifted in the wind, the bare branches scratching lightly against the siding. I stood by the front window, looking out at the road that would soon carry them here. My hands rested on the back of the chair by the table, the same chair I planned to sit in when I told them the truth. They thought this would be the day they took control. It would be the day they learned they'd already lost it. By the time the clock struck 4, the sun was already low, laying amber stripes across the living room floor. I'd set the kettle to boil again, not out of hospitality, but to have something warm in my hands when they walked in. The knock came, brisk and expectant. I opened the door to find Clara in a tailored coat, Kyle just behind her with a takeout tray of coffee cups. Both wore the kind of polite smiles people use before delivering bad news. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. The air they brought in smelled faintly of cold and gasoline. They settled at the kitchen table without waiting to be asked, setting the coffee between them. Clara began first, smoothing her gloves on the table. "Helen, we've been thinking about how to make things easier for you. This house is so much work: stairs, repairs, snow in the winter. We've found a lovely condo downtown, no maintenance, close to everything. We can help you get settled." Kyle leaned forward, nodding. We've even spoken to a realtor. She said this place could move fast, especially if you're willing to sign before the end of the month. I sipped my tea, letting their words float over me. And in return, I asked lightly. Well, Clara said, her smile tightening. The sale proceeds would go into a joint account. We'd make sure your needs are covered. I set my cup down, the porcelain clicking softly on the saucer. That's thoughtful, but unnecessary. They exchanged a quick glance, confusion just starting to show. I reached under the table and placed 2 folders in front of me. The first, I slid toward them. Inside were copies of the updated deed, will, and trust documents. As of this morning, I said, the house and land are held in the Carver Preservation Trust. Irrevocable, no sale without my written consent, and my consent is not for sale. Kyle's jaw tightened. Clara's smile faltered. The second folder I kept closer, but opened just enough for them to see the fundraiser flyer, Clara's note, and Kyle's endorsed check. And here, I continued, her a few reminders of why I've chosen to keep things under my control. Clara's face paled. Kyle sat back, his hands flattening against his thighs. For a moment, neither spoke. I appreciate your concern, I said, standing slowly. But from this point on, all matters regarding my property and finances are closed. You have no authority, no access, and no claim. That's not a threat. It's simply the truth. The kettle began to whistle behind me, sharp and steady. I turned to take it off the heat, giving them a moment to absorb what I'd just handed them. When I faced them again, they were still sitting stiffly, coffee cooling in front of them. Now, I said, pouring hot water into my cup. If you'd like to stay for tea, you're welcome. If not, the door is just there. Neither reached for their coffee. Clara rose first, her gloves clenched in her hand. Kyle followed, avoiding my eyes. The door closed behind them with a hollow sound. I stood in the quiet kitchen, steam curling from my cup, and let the stillness settle back in. They'd come to take something from me. They left with nothing but the knowledge they'd lost it long before today. The morning broke in a soft wash of pale light, spilling through the lace curtains onto the kitchen floor. I could hear the faint tick of the wall clock and nothing else. No tires crunching in the driveway, no hurried footsteps on the porch. The silence felt solid, almost physical, like a wall built overnight. I moved through the house barefoot, the wood floors cool under my feet. The kettle sat quiet on the stove, I hadn't even turned it on yet. Instead, I opened the front door just enough to see the street. Fresh snow had fallen in the night, untouched, a smooth sheet from my gate all the way to the corner. The phone on the counter stayed still, its screen dark. No missed calls, no messages. Yesterday had been the kind of line you don't uncross. They'd come here expecting to steer my life in the direction they'd chosen. Now, they were somewhere out there, recalculating in silence. I brewed my tea slowly, letting the steam warm my face. The first sip tasted better than it had in weeks, not because of the tea itself, but because it wasn't laced with the edge of waiting for someone to take something from me. I set the cup down and leaned on the counter, thinking about how victory rarely looks like a celebration. Sometimes it looks like a quiet kitchen and a street no one dares to walk down toward your door. By mid-morning, I took a slow walk through the rooms, checking the locks and closing the shutters against the bright glare of snow. In the bedroom, the fireproof box was still tucked beneath the bed, exactly where I'd left it. I slid my hand over the lid, feeling the weight of everything inside, not just paper, but the work it had taken to secure it. In the living room, the armchair by the window caught a patch of sun. I sat down, pulling a small throw blanket over my legs. Across the street, Mrs. Talbot was shoveling her walk, her breath puffing in quick clouds. She glanced up and waved, and I waved back. A normal gesture, free of the undercurrent that had run through so many recent interactions. The day moved slowly, unhurried. I read a few chapters of a book, answered a letter from an old friend in Maine, and baked a small loaf of bread just because I could. The smell filled the kitchen, wrapping itself around me like a reminder that this house was still mine. Not just in name, but in presence. Outside, the afternoon shadows stretched longer, the snow deepening into shades of blue. I poured another cup of tea and carried it to the front window. From here, I could see the road clear to the bend where it disappeared behind the treepty. Still, I let the warmth of the cup seep into my hands, my breath leaving faint marks on the glass. Yesterday had been about making them see the boundaries. Today was about feeling them hold. It wasn't the end of the battle. There were always other angles, other attempts. But for now, this was enough. The quiet wasn't just the absence of their noise, it was the sound of my life returning to its own rhythm. And standing there, watching the slow fall of snow under a dimming sky, I knew this was my first, undeniable win. By late afternoon, the snow had settled into a fine mist, falling in delicate threads that barely touched the ground. I wrapped a scarf around my neck and stepped outside to check the new P.O. box for the first time since I'd rented it. The walk was quiet, my boots leaving the only prints along the block. Inside the post office, the air was warm and faintly metallic, carrying the smell of old envelopes and cardboard. I turned the small brass key in box 214. A single white envelope sat inside, no return address, my name printed in block letters. The paper was heavy, expensive. Someone had taken care with it. Back at home, I laid the envelope on the kitchen table and waited a moment, letting my tea steep while I looked at it. The seal was clean, the flap pressed perfectly flat. I slid a letter opener under the edge and drew it across. Inside was one sheet of paper folded in thirds. The message was short. Helen, we understand your position. For now, we'll give you space. But life changes quickly and opportunities come when you least expect them. Take care of yourself. Have no signature. No direct mention of the house, the trust, or the confrontation. But I could hear their voices in the careful phrasing, the mix of false warmth and unfinished business. For now was a seed they hoped would sprout into doubt. I read it twice, then a third time, searching for anything more. Watermarks, impressions on the paper, a hint of where it had been written. There was nothing but the words and the fact that they had used the new P.O. box. That meant they'd gone looking for it. I folded the letter back along its creases and slipped it into a plastic sleeve, then into the leverage envelope. It belonged there, a reminder that retreat didn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it was just a change in angle. The kettle began to whistle softly. I poured the tea, added a slice of lemon, and carried it to the armchair by the window. Outside, the light was fading, the sky pressing down with a heavy gray that promised more snow overnight. My reflection in the glass looked steady, almost unreadable, exactly how I wanted it to be. They might wait weeks before trying again, or they might test me tomorrow. Either way, the lines were drawn, the ground fortified. And if they came back, they'd find me in the same place I'd been yesterday and today, ready, calm, and already 3 steps ahead. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the heat sink into my chest. The letter was a message, but it was also an admission. They knew the rules had changed. They knew I was willing to hold my ground. Outside, a lone car passed, its headlights sweeping across the snow before disappearing around the bend. The quiet returned just as quickly as it had gone, wrapping the house in its soft, unshakable shield. I leaned back, the cup warm in my hands, and let the evening settle around me. This was my life now, guarded, deliberate, and mine entirely. Whatever they planned next, I would be here to meet it. And they would learn again that I don't give back what I've already reclaimed. 3 weeks later, the snow had begun to melt in uneven patches, revealing the dark soil beneath. The lavender garden out back was still sleeping under a blanket of frost, but here and there, green tips pushed through as if testing the air. Each morning, I pulled on my boots and walked the perimeter of the yard, checking the fences and brushing stray leaves from the garden beds. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but the smell of thawing earth brought a kind of comfort I hadn't felt in a long time. This was my land, quiet, unhurried, answering only to the seasons and to me. Inside, the kitchen table had become a small command center. Stacks of letters from old friends sat in neat piles, waiting for replies. A postcard from Maine, a Christmas card from last year I'd only now opened, and a short note from Mrs. Talbot inviting me over for coffee next Tuesday. I kept them all within reach, each one a reminder that connection didn't have to come with conditions. In the afternoons, I sometimes left the door to the porch open, letting the scent of cedar drift inside. Neighbors I trusted, like Mrs. Talbot or Mr. Green from 2 houses down, would stop by to return a borrowed book or share a loaf of bread. There was no talk of selling, no careful probing questions, just small exchanges that felt human and honest. One Thursday, I sat in the armchair by the window with a cup of tea and a yellowed envelope from the bottom of my desk drawer. Inside was a letter from my late husband, written the year we first moved in. His handwriting looped across the page in steady lines. This house will stand as long as someone loves it enough to keep it whole. I read it twice, the words steadying something deep in me. The trust, the deed, the P.O. box, all of it was part of keeping that promise. But so was this, living here, tending to the soil, letting the rooms stay full of the life we built. As the light faded, I stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, the same familiar sound I'd heard for decades. I wrapped my hands around the railing and looked out over the yard. The air was still, except for a single crow perched high in the oak tree, its feathers catching the last gold of the day. This was more than winning a fight. This was reclaiming a rhythm that had been interrupted, then making it my own again. And standing there, watching the first stars blink into the cold sky, I knew this was the life I intended to protect, not just for myself, but for whatever came after me. The first real day of spring arrived with a softness in the air, the kind that made you want to leave every window open. By mid-morning, sunlight spilled across the porch, and I'd set the table with a teapot, mismatched cups, and a plate of shortbread cookies. Mrs. Talbot arrived first, bringing a jar of her homemade raspberry jam. Mr. Green came soon after, holding a basket of fresh rolls still warm from his oven. A few more neighbors trickled in, each taking a seat on the porch where the boards hummed under the weight of old friendships. We talked about small things at first: the thawing garden beds, the rumor of a new bakery opening downtown, the robins that had returned to the oak tree. The conversation felt easy, without the sharp edges I'd grown used to navigating. When the tea was poured and the cookies half gone, I set my cup down and folded my hands in my lap. "I wanted to tell you all something," I began, my voice carrying just enough to be heard over the gentle creak of the rocking chair. "This house has been my home for nearly 50 years. It's where my husband and I built a life, where we planted the lavender, where every mark on the wood means something to me. And I've decided it will stay here as it is, for the community." I told them about the Carver Preservation Trust, how the deed was secured, and how the land would be cared for by a local conservation group when I was gone. It won't be sold or torn down. It will be here for anyone who values what it stands for. There was a quiet moment after I finished, the kind that carries more weight than words. Then Mrs. Talbot reached across the table, her fingers warm over mine. "That's a beautiful thing, Helen. You've given us all something worth keeping." Mr. Green nodded. "Places like this, people forget they can disappear. You've made sure this one won't." We sat together for a while longer, sipping tea as the breeze moved through the porch, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faintest trace of lavender still sleeping beneath the soil. By early afternoon, the plates were empty, the teapot drained. My neighbors left with promises to stop by soon, their footsteps fading down the path. I stayed on the porch, the sun warm on my shoulders, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard. This was what I'd fought for. Not just walls and land, but the sense that what we cherish can outlast us if we guard it. The lavender would bloom again, the house would stand, and the trust would hold. And as I leaned back in my chair, the boards creaking in their familiar way, I knew the story of this place was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who would love it enough to keep it whole. The evening settled in with a slow fade of gold to blue. The kind of sky that makes you pause before turning on a light. I sat on the porch, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, listening to the quiet wrap itself around the house. In the distance, the oak tree swayed gently, its branches reaching toward the roof like an old friend standing guard. Beyond it, the lavender rose lay in patient silence, waiting for their season. Every board beneath my feet, every stone in the path felt steady, rooted in something unshakable. I thought about the battles fought in whispers and pauses, the victories measured not in applause but in the peace that follows. This house had been tested, and so had I. And in the end, we were both still standing. Somewhere down the road, life would change again. It always does. But whatever came next, I had done what I set out to do. I had kept the promise, to Henry and to myself, that this place would remain whole. As the first stars pierced the darkening sky, I leaned back in the rocker, the boards humming softly beneath me. The fight was over, the legacy secured. And for the first time in a long while, the future felt as solid as the ground beneath my feet.